Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to everyone that's joining. Catherine, welcome back. Thanks so much for coming. And to everyone else who is just logging on and joining the conversation, thanks so much for being here. We'll get things kicked off in just a minute or two, waiting for a couple more folks to join as everyone gets into Zoom. But would love to ask for anyone that feels comfortable doing so that we just turn on our cameras. We did have a really kind of good group yesterday for face-to-face conversations. So would love to just encourage everyone, after the introductions, we'll make sure everyone can unmute if they feel comfortable doing that. But please, would love to see everyone's faces. I know we're all feeling a little bit physically distanced. So would love to encourage you to turn on your video. All right, we've still got a couple of folks coming in, so we're just going to give it about another minute or two. But for everyone who has joined thus far, I'll just reiterate that we would love to see videos on if possible. I know this is more of a roundtable format, which is a little bit weird and virtual, and we're all still learning that, but we would really like this to be a face-to-face conversation as much as possible, and just encourage dialogue. This is an opportunity for everyone to ask questions as well. So in the interest of time and knowing that everyone has a busy schedule, we're going to go ahead and get some things kicked off here. So just a reminder for everyone that if you are here, you are at the Data-Driven Approaches to Optimize Research Uptake Roundtable. If you're looking for another conversation, this is not the roundtable for you, but we are happy to have you here and really excited about a great conversation coming up. Just to get a few things kicked off with some housekeeping notes. First, all the attendees are currently muted, but we are happy to unmute you once we get into the discussion portion of this, which will be very shortly, and would really encourage you to be a part of this conversation and to turn your video on should you feel comfortable, to engage with us either via the chat box and Q&A, or to also ask questions verbally. We had a great conversation yesterday and I'm looking forward to another one today. The chat button, just to remind everyone, is located at the bottom of your screen near your mute button and the other meeting controls, or the top of the screen, depending on what type of device you're using and platform. And in the interest of making us all feel connected, really just would love to reiterate the video piece so we can see each other's faces and have some virtual connection. However, I know, technical difficulties always arise. If you are having any technical difficulties, let us know or visit the tech desk, the help desk in the lobby of the platform. Finally, we encourage you all to participate as active listeners and to really engage in this discussion. This is your meeting and your opportunity to gain some great answers to your questions. But without further ado, I am more than pleased to welcome our discussion leaders for today, Dominique Lessard of KIF1A and Xin Lu of Notre Dame University. They're each going to share just a little bit of their background with you as well once I get off of my soapbox, and then just to kind of orient us in the conversation, and we'll get some Q&A going. And so I will now turn it over to Dominique just to kick things off with the introduction.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Great to see you all. My name is Dominique Lessard. I am the Science Communication Director for KIF1A.org, which is a nonprofit that's dedicated to improving the lives of those affected by KIF1A associated neurological disorder. Another big part of our mission is accelerating research to find a cure, and that's really where I spend a lot of my time working within our organization as Science Communication Director. And my main role really is to serve as sort of a liaison between any stakeholder that our organization may have that's interested in learning more or engaging with the science behind our mission. So these can be a lot of different types of stakeholders. First and foremost, we have our community, our patients and our families that we represent, communicating scientific and therapeutic developments in a fast manner, as well as a manner that everyone is able to understand. We also have research stakeholders coming from academia, as well as industry, which require two completely different sets of communication tools. And we also have stakeholders like clinicians that are treating our patients that we can converse with as well. A little bit of background of how I got to kifone.org in the rare disease space. I actually started out as a researcher in academia. And once I made contact with the rare disease community, I've talked to a couple of people about this. Once you're here, like how can you leave? And so I didn't. And I made the switch to the nonprofit space, joining kifone.org.
Thanks so much, Dominique. Over to you, Xin.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Xin Lu. I'm a Bowler Assistant Professor at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. And I'm a researcher at Notre Dame, and my research interest is on rare cancers. So, I'm the junior chair for the Bowler Symposium Center for Rare and Genetic Disease. So this is our name of the center. This is the mark I use, also is the same name. So, so our center has our director is interested in the neurological rare diseases, where I'm focused on more on rare cancers. And then our goal is to find new mechanisms and treatment strategies to help the patient community. And over the last couple of years that I'm here, we have made a lot of interesting discoveries for two types of rare cancers. One is called von Hippel-Lindau syndrome. So this is a multi-organ genetic disease because of the mutation of a gene called VHL, von Hippel-Lindau disease, von Hippel-Lindau gene, the VHL gene. And we collaborate with a patient family who actually reached us. So we can collaborate with them to study their particular mutation of this gene, and we published the result early this year on the Journal of Medical Genetics. And also another paper that we recently published is focused on another rare cancer, a very morbid disease called penile squamous cell carcinoma. So this is the cancer developing in the penis of the males. So it's very rare in the US, but it's much more common in some other underdeveloped countries. We have collaborators at Puerto Rico, where this disease is more prominent. And then we published a paper recently in Nature Communication to introduce the first transgenic mouse model of this disease. With this model, we show that special kinds of immunotherapy can be very effective to treat this disease. So yeah, so this is what we work on in the lab. And as I said, our center actually carry many more lines of research on rare disease, especially the neurological diseases. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So for anyone that just joined, and I see a couple of my coworkers in here as well, definitely would encourage anyone who feels comfortable to turn on their video, but would love to just ask it to open the conversation first to anyone that has any questions in the audience. So I will just pause for a second. Does anyone have a question? All right, so we'll jump into a few prepared questions, but please interrupt us. We want this to be a dialogue and a conversation. So, whenever you're ready, throw them at us. But to get things started, we had, I think, just thought a little bit about the fireside chat this morning, which brought up some really great themes for anyone who was able to be there. It was a great conversation about focusing a lot on natural history studies. For, those who weren't, encourage you to view it on demand after, but within that, a lot of what was talked about was really the importance of natural history studies of getting them started early, of starting those conversations, and of being intentional in thinking about the choices you make of where those are housed, who owns the data, and all of the other kind of data governance and data sharing pieces within there. So would love to just ask both of our discussion leaders, and Dominique, maybe if you want to start, and then Xin, just to comment a little bit on, your thoughts around this, and where you think people should be focusing or really thinking about these as they're starting to engage in research.
Sure, happy to start. We touched a little bit about this yesterday, and I think I referred to a natural history studies being like a form of currency. It's really a tool that is used to engage in these conversations between organizations and different stakeholders. A large part of that, like we heard about in the fireside chat, is getting these going as early as possible. But once the study is started, what are the next steps? Like any study, a natural history study has to constantly have people looking at it and assessing what is being collected and if that data is going to be valuable once it gets presented to a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company, because that really would be the most unfortunate circumstance, is if you had years of research, of data collected, and you present it to somebody and they say, it really should have been done in a different way to make this impactful for us. Do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
Regarding different patient organizations or different groups maybe having histories or registries, is there a recommendation on if that's best practice to have multiples, or should we all try to conglomerate if we're all focused on, per se, like EDS? I know we have a couple different organizations working on that. Is it better to have something all put together, or can individual advocacy groups or patient organizations do their own, or is there a sort of process towards that?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I think that that's going to be a really organization dependent choice. I don't think that there's necessarily a right one. It depends on what the goals are within your organization. Coming at this from a perspective of having a background in research, there's an extensive amount of power that comes from big data. In the past 10, 5, even like yearly, we're seeing these huge advances in the computational power that comes from having big data sets. And big data sets on an individual basis, when we're talking about small populations of rare diseases, that's a challenge, right? Because the numbers aren't there in comparison to other diseases to generate these large sets. So it doesn't necessarily have to be what is the best way to organize my natural history study, but it's more of a question of, once I have that data, how is it going to be shared? How is it organized? And those are conversations that should be had early on within your community. Those conversations of, as a community, what are we comfortable with? Let's talk about the concept of data sharing even before we're at that point. So then when you are at that point and you have all of this momentum, that you have accumulated enough data to begin thinking about merging in big data sets, that you already know where you stand. There's a constant conversation happening instead of people being thrown off once you get to that point and being like, data, where is my data going? Like, definitely having that established in the beginning.
Thank you so much. Xin, I don't know if you wanted to add anything there.
Sure. I can make some comment about natural history. I have not been working on natural history studies myself yet, but at the center, our director, Dr. Kasuri Hardar, she actually is heavily involved in natural history studies because the center receives a lot of calls and messages from the various patient communities of various rare diseases, and then she actually has a mechanism with the people who hired to collect those information under strict HIPAA protection, and then upon the agreement with the patient families, she also work together with undergrads at Notre Dame in a very specialized course, very popular course. Actually, she actually won the teaching award because of this course to summarize those natural history studies and then publish those in some leading journals in natural history. So I think this is a very good exercise, and then really helps the patient families to read those papers and then know what the disease natural causes look like, and then potentially seek for helps that way. And then I agree with Dominique about the planning for those natural history studies, because with more and more emerging concepts of how health, how for instance cancer incidence and then the degree of the disease, the treatment are affected by things like lifestyle, etc. So when you collect data of natural history, it's increasingly important to incorporate the parameters that you may not be pay attention to before. And then I think those are important messages. When you collect data, it's better to communicate with researchers and then to kind of know what's emerging and what's interesting, what's important to collect. So the database will start with comprehensive and then ultimately lead to impactful insight and publications and then benefits to the patient community.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for great questions, Sarah. I appreciate that. And I think this raises some, really good conversations around how you approach natural history studies. But, I think sometimes part of the conversation as well is, where do you start? What are the pieces that who do you need to start talking to? How do you get that process started? And what opportunities are there to also maybe, reach out to others that have done this before and learn from them? So I don't know if there's any advice that you all would kind of share on that as well. I know we've touched a little bit on it, but just in terms of kind of first steps and early considerations.
I would say that one of the first places that you should start is starting a dialogue within your community, if that is not a dialogue that has already been started, because ultimately a natural history study, a survey that goes out, is only going to be as strong as its participation rate. And that can be, that can be difficult to communicate. So taking the time to really sit down and have frank discussions about, the functions of natural history studies, what they can lead to. Bring in a consultant, an outside consultant, if you need to have those discussions so that everybody is on the same page once you get to the point where there's a survey ready to go out, that it is not being held up in terms of participation.
Yeah, so another, agree with Dominic, that is definitely very important to pay attention to at the very beginning. Another, I think, if possible, when people carry on these natural history studies, it's a good idea to seek for help from people who can help. For instance, if you can get a researcher with background in relevant biology and maybe a biostatistician who can help with statistics, and then so that your study is statistically powered. And because if, let's say later, if you want to publish this and then kind of have some impact, and those are requirements for reach a certain journal. So I think we were experiencing some learning curves for those things here at the center, and then now we know better what are needed to publish those natural history studies, so more people can read about it and actually benefit from it.
That's great, and I think good points all around. In terms, and I think you mentioned publications as well, which is a great point. And I know, Dominique, you have a lot of thoughts on the SciComm side too. I think one of these important pieces around this, whether it's natural history studies or other forms of patient data collection, is how are you sharing that with folks? And so, Xin, I don't know if you want to start here, but what are places where people can really get their information in front of the right researchers, in front of the right stakeholders, and how can you kind of identify those and think about transmitting that further and disseminating it?
Right. Yeah. So, well, in terms of how patients can get information, Well, I only can speak for what I know. So one resource is across this search engines, right? So you can search the disease and then just go through it and then see what can be useful information. There are tons of information. Of course, many of those are not really relevant, but that's, I guess, the source number one. And secondly is go to those journals that actually publish studies about natural history. And this kind of go back to the examples I said about our center to publish. It's not an easy thing to publish like that because natural history sometimes is considered as purely descriptive. So, and the journals typically don't like to publish purely descriptive research nowadays. They like to publish more mechanistic studies. That's also a kind of why I said that if in the early design of the research, you can incorporate some mechanistic insights from experts like biologists or statisticians. So this can be something that is more elevated than a purely description. Then yeah, the results can be disseminated to a much larger base. And then lastly, I think that there are, as far as I know, there are resources of different foundations, etc. For example, the disease I work with, the multiple disease, there's an alliance called the VHL Alliance, and then they have a pretty active, collaborations and the integrations of researchers, stakeholders, patients, families, etc. And then they also have a very good mechanism to fund like a very small pilot studies. Those studies can be natural history studies or mechanistic studies. And then the patients are heavily involved. And then I know there at least there's one study that's funded to create databases that collect the patients like lifestyles, diets, exercise, etc. And then they are working on the analysis. Actually, I'm partly involved too. Like they are working on the statistical analysis of those databases and try to gain some insights. I think patients can certainly contribute and participate in this type of studies that are more organized and then led by researchers. And then those are, I think, will be very meaningful and lead to insights.
Yeah, great points, Xin. And the ultimate goal would be to have a published natural history study, right? That you could hand somebody and say, here it is, right? Here's everything you need to know. But the reality for a lot of rare diseases is we're not there yet. Yeah. We hope to be, that's the goal, but what can we be providing people in the interim until we get to that point? And when I think about what the function of a natural history study is it's really a way to tell a story. It tells a story about a cohort of people, and it brings you into their daily lives and the things that they experience. And the way that we tell stories to people is we tell them differently depending on who we're talking to. So for our organization, we have prepared decks with information that address different contingents of people. I have a deck that I can talk to high school students about, and I have a deck that I can talk to high science biotech investors about. They all are focused around the same content and the same data, but the way that we present that data is very different. And so this brings up the point where it's one thing to have a natural history study and to have data that is willing to be shared, but it's a completely other discussion to talk about how you're going to display that information, how you're going to communicate it. And it's typically not a one-size-fits-all kind of deal, because we don't want a one-size-fits-all approach, right? We want shots on goal. We want eggs in baskets, whatever your metaphor is. We want as many opportunities as possible to tell our story about our natural history studies.
So to talk to what Dominique is saying, you have to consider, she's talking about how you communicate to different stakeholders. I think you have to consider what data is valuable to the different stakeholders when you start, and have those discussions when you start, because the researchers are going to want to tap into certain kinds of data sets, and the FDA is going to want different kind of data sets, and the caregivers are going to want to have feedback and see different data sets. And that's something you have to think about, is who wants to see what and what's de-risking the company's coming to you and jumping on your disorder.
Absolutely.
And you have to think about all of it. You can't just think about one.
Absolutely. And I think that, also brings up something that we talked a little bit about, which is, setting expectations early in these research collaborations and making sure, that data sharing, especially, I think, and kind of data use is really early outlined in a concrete way. And so, and I think I, would love anyone to comment on this topic, but, what are some key considerations in patient data sharing and access to data that we all need to think about before we build out these data sets or registries or natural history studies?
I think that data ownership is a conversation that needs to be had from the beginning. There's a lot of different opinions about who should and should not own data, and I'm not here to convince you one way or another, but I am here to say that these conversations should be had early on. Not only who has ownership over data, but what does that ownership entail? Like, what is the fine print of how they're allowed to distribute and analyze data? Is it classified? Is it declassified? If it is declassified, are there still ways to backtrack it to individuals? Those are all considerations to have when you get to the point of data sharing and progressing into data ownership conversations that should be had.
I think, the data sharing, or like more broadly, like the sharing of even clinical samples from the rare disease patients is very challenging. Like, for instance, I can give you an example. Like, when we started this child disease, I said that we have this family who are very willing, actually alumni of Notre Dame, very willing to work with us. And then they have the entire family has this multiple generations having this disease, but they actually have their clinical records in hospitals in Chicago, and then they also actually have the clinical samples archived there as well. And then the patient actually reached doctors back there and saying is willing to share this information with the Notre Dame Center. But it took a long time for the physicians there to release the information to us. Even there's all this paperwork that has been worked out. It still takes a long time, and also eventually we was not able to actually acquire the archive samples, and also they also refused to let's say get the blood from patient families and then give us to use. So later, the family actually, after signing documents, came to Notre Dame to local center in the local clinic here to get their blood, and then we use those blood to carry out the research. So there's definitely barriers, but this barrier is not just for rare disease. It's everywhere. Like I was in MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston for 6 years, and then in the same center, it's also not easy to collaborate and get either database or clinical samples from surgeons. It just has to be, just as Dominique said, it's better to have something established early in a prospective research. Once it's already documented, once already collected, there's a resistance to further share those with a third party, not only because of regulation, also because ownership concerns, etc. So those are human nature. I think those are totally understandable. So that's why when we design research, it's better to be more comprehensive and involve more stakeholders and researchers, and then consider what's the outcome, what's the delivery you want to have. Do you only want to have a database to share with a few folks, or you want this to be more impactful? If the latter, then you're gonna have to be mindful of whoever that's gonna be later use this, then you better involve maybe early on. But I know it's not kind of easier said than done, but I think those are directions we can strive for.
I also want to point out that while it would be ideal that all of these discussions would be happening early on as all of these foundations are being formed, they don't, and that they can't, because these discussions are based on acquiring knowledge that we didn't have when we started. And that's science, you know, that's why we do research. If we had all the answers, we wouldn't need to research anything. And so I don't want people to be discouraged about, you know, what you have or have not done based on the age of your organization and where you're at. Where you're at is where you're at. What's important is you assess where you're at, and you take the knowledge from these sessions and say, we're doing really well in our data collection, but you know, we haven't talked about data sharing. So we need to start having that conversation. It's not too late, but the earlier the better.
And also the patients, sometimes they are willing to share, but you know, there are a lot of regulations from, let's say, where they say they are, you know, doctors, and in many cases, eventually you can't share because of the regulation. So, but those just something like a patient need to keep in mind. I mean, and also, of course, this is also ultimately for the protection of the patient, especially, let's say, the genetic information, you know, the genetic materials, you don't want to share with anybody. So those things have to be kept in mind.
Of course. And I think you both bring, you know, this is such a great point too, you know, that this is not meant to be any sort of why aren't you doing this yet, but more of you know, lessons learned. And, you know, I think I would just, you know, maybe ask, you know, at least our two leaders and anyone else that feels comfortable, you know, what is one thing that you maybe wish you knew before you started working on, you know, kind of patient data collection and structuring, that you kind of were like, wow, that would have been so helpful?
I can address this as how I first found out about the rare disease community. I wish that I had known when I was a researcher that the research I was doing mattered to the rare disease community, because I had no idea. I wasn't specifically researching a rare disease. You know, I was researching the protein that is responsible for the rare disease that I now represent. And had I known that, you know, that would have, and it did, it drastically changed my life. I'm here now, but you know, had I been a younger researcher, it would have drastically changed the way that I thought about my projects, tailored my projects, applied for funding, vocalized, you know, advocacy. And so now that I'm on this side of it, that's something that I try and keep in mind when engaging with young investigators, and particularly investigators that are in transition points in their lives, whether it be grad school to postdoc to job to another job. You know, those transition points are a really impactful point to start having these discussions if they haven't already been had with people, to make them realize that what they're doing is impactful to a world that they may not know anything about, like I didn't.
Just to add, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to add an example from our community. I'm also with KIF1A.org, and I'm lucky to work with Dr. Dom. But an insight that we've had in our community that I can't take credit for, but came from Dr. Wendy Chung, who helps manage our KIF1A natural history study. And her philosophy is, you know, we don't know what we don't know, which is kind of echoing some comments from Dominique earlier. And so a very clear and powerful example of this is before we launched the KIF1A natural history study, you know, there had been some, you know, research on KIF1A and some case studies that had been published on KIF1A patients, but not this comprehensive natural history study that we have. And we didn't realize until doing our study that some KIF1A patients have kidney problems. There's this connection there that had never been discussed in the literature before, because no one was asking KIF1A patients about their kidneys because they assumed they weren't having kidney problems. And so Dr. Chung's approach with our natural history study has been to ask a very broad array of questions with seemingly unrelated medical challenges and conditions. And now we're starting to find these connections that have never been made before. So that, you know, when we're talking about start now with these conversations about data sharing and consent and all that, but start now thinking, what types of questions are we asking in the natural history study? And I think that that's something that I'm very grateful for, that we've had that approach that we don't know what we don't know, so we need to ask, you know, because it's uncovered a lot of really helpful data for our community.
Right. So yeah, I just want to mention one thing is the young people that are interested in this, because you know, before I came to Notre Dame, I was in the biggest cancer hospital, and then everyone is talking about cancer, and I'm the Anderson, and I actually don't know too much about rare disease. You know, I know something about rare cancers, but not other rare diseases. But after I came to Notre Dame, I can see the passion from the undergrads who are really passionate about, passionate about, also compassionate about this, patient communities, and they work really hard in their courses, etc., to also reach out to the patient families to carry out this natural history studies. I think I see a lot of promise and hope from this young generation of kids who, many of those will become doctors, will become medical, careers, and because Notre Dame, a lot of let's say biology majors go ahead and become medical students, and then many of those have the desire to become a doctor treating rare disorders. And I'm just glad that we have those young people who will continue to contribute to this. So this is what like our director always says. Also to me, also to my lab members, don't think like what they're working on is not worth as much as people who work on, let's say, breast cancer, for instance, with pretty much more attention. It's not the case. It's actually equally important, or maybe even more important, because those rarities are often neglected and overlooked by the let's say mainstay research community. So really we should be proud of ourselves and then do our best to lead to new insights, and then those are the lessons I learned, and I really appreciate that.
Great. Any other questions from the audience before we get to the last couple? All right. So I think one thing that we've touched on throughout this, but I think is worth mentioning more explicitly as well, is how can patients or researchers best be stewards in ensuring that research and data are not siloed and are made as broadly available as possible to both academic and industry researchers?
I brought this up yesterday, and I'm going to bring it again because I really believe in it, and that is being champions of open science. And a lot of times I think open science tends to get clumped in as just being about accessibility of content, which is a huge part of open science, paywalls that limit people to accessing content that they have a right to access. But it goes way beyond that. Open science is a movement that discusses how we communicate science, how we share science, how we make it accessible to all in terms of access, in terms of language, in terms of content. Researchers and advocates both have a role in advocating for open science. Researchers have maybe a more obvious or direct role in that you can publish in open science journals, or you can use a really privileged voice in research to voice how important it is to you. But nobody should underestimate the voice that can come from patients and their families. That's one of the things that struck me most about interacting with the rare disease community, is the power that all of you have the ability to generate in your communities. And so be advocates and keep screaming from the rooftops, because believe me, people hear what you're saying.
Yeah, I can also say a little bit about the open science concept. I'm also totally for it. For me, it's more specifically, let's say, open access publication, open access journals. Historically, many of the scientific journals require like subscription fees, etc. So, only like institutions and universities have subscriptions. And then, like if you are like a layperson who are not work on these places, you can't have access. So, but now like in the last few decades, place like a PLOS or BMC, etc. They start to have these open access journals, and nowadays there are many of those open access journals. For example, the two papers I talk about, like, we published, one in VHL disease, one in penile cancer. They are both published in open access journals, and then anyone can just open that and download the paper to read about it. Of course, this comes to a cost to the researchers. So if you want to publish into OA journals, you have to pay for the, they call it article processing fee, like APC, article processing costs. And then this can go as high as $5,000 for the Nature Communication publication, and then as low as maybe $1,000. Those fees are not, apparently they're pretty expensive, so it need to come from some kind of funding. And then this is where things can get awkward, because a lot of research on rare disorders are not well funded with understandable reasons. There's tons of money going to breast cancer, prostate cancer, and then most of the rare disorders are dwarfed in terms of funding by those more common diseases for all obviously understanding reasons. But I want to echo Dominique on the patients' force on this. The patients they already done a lot, but the continued advocacy for fundings to fund the rare diseases will be able to also help researchers to have the fund to publish in those open OA journals. And then, so basically it's a cycle, right? So, it's not like a researcher asks for money, the continuous so greedy or something. It's just like there are many places. If there's no fund, it's just we can't get the ball rolling. So but as a researcher, I'm super appreciative for all the patients I have worked with, also the community as a whole. But as a group, as together, we have more work to do to move this forward.
Xin, that's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up about the cost that researchers will accrue choosing to publish openly. And one thing that I would encourage researchers to do, if it is in their comfort level, or if they're willing to entertain it being in their comfort level, is if you need to publish in a for-profit journal, then put out a preprint. Put it on bioRxiv. Preprints are free.
That's absolutely right.
They come with the caveat of they've not been peer reviewed. There's quite a bit of peer review that goes on the comments section of bioRxiv if you've ever been on there. But that's one way. And by contributing to systems like that are making scientific content available, it's those small changes that help make a bigger change in what we value as a scientific society, and hopefully trending into a more open science mindset.
Absolutely. The preprint has been transforming, I think, how people publish in the last few years, right? So the physics and math or something, they have this for decades, but for biology, it just came alive in a few years ago. So we also put our papers on bioRxiv now. And as you said, there's a very vibrant discussion, and this show the best by the COVID-19. See how many papers are in bioRxiv the last few months that are kind of stir all the discussions, and there's kind of course there's shortcoming of they're not being peer reviewed, but I totally agree with you. These are the great place to publish those things without cost and then to benefit the patients early. That's definitely the truth.
Great, and I also wanted to ask Heidi to unmute herself as well. She had a question.
I had 2 points. One, the importance of a position like Dominique's, the science communication director, in managing the expectations of the patients and caregivers with open publications like preprints, right? Because there is a level of hope when we see things like potential disease reversal with certain treatments, but when they haven't been reviewed, someone who has a strong scientific background speaking to the community about these early publications is very important. And then the second point about the cost of publishing things, in an open environment, when you submit a budget, and especially that can come to the patient advocacy group, right? So at our organization, we fund data sharing across clinics and require that they're sharing and that they're making their data available both to the other institutions so that they can work collaboratively, and that data will be available to the public, and that it'll be published openly, right? So they can submit to me a budget that includes those fees. So as part of the, and it's not cheap, of course, but as part of that early stage planning of what research we're going to do, the researchers can include, hey, we want to be part of this process, that we want this to go into our data sharing, and we also want to publish everything publicly. These are the costs it will entail. And then it's all transparent. It doesn't become a problem later.
Exactly.
I do want to spin off of a point that Heidi brought up about transparency at the end, and also how we communicate the scientific process to people who aren't familiar with it. We've talked about this a lot in our leadership team about how science is marketed as being from point A to point B. You come up with a study and then you come up with an answer, and science is great. And science is great, but it's not from point A to point B. It's from point A to point X, and you go A, B, C, D, A, G, A, Q, and it's all over the place. But that's not communicated, and it can be frustrating to people who say, well, we have this person and they're working on this thing, and why is this taking so long? We thought that it was just, we have an idea and then we figure it out. And it's being transparent about the process, and not marketing it as a process that is laborious and long, but highlighting that each part of the process is important. Each step from A to B to Q to Y is important to ultimately get to that end point.
Completely agree. And good points made all around. So I think Haley had a question as well. So I will unmute her.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, we have helped fund some IPSC work. It's still in development. COVID-19 slowed so many things down. This is included. It was some of our initial funding. So we feel in the contract it had some of the wording we expected, but not necessarily the implementation. I would say that's not there. So we have a couple of researchers who have IPSC developed. They're not in the US. And so what I was kind of just wanting to get, if y'all have any experience with US, we haven't run into a barrier. It's me looking forward of, have you had any issues of where US researchers want to access lines that researchers have developed that they've not put on something like Cornell or Rutgers or something like that? It's at their institution. And any suggestions?
Yes.
Go ahead, Xin.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so for requesting cell lines, that's always a tricky business, I can tell you that. So let's say my lab use a lot of cell lines, and then we definitely prefer to buy it from, let's say, places like ADCC or the companies you mentioned. Those are the best places. If you want to request the cell lines from a domestic lab, you just need to do MTA, like a material transfer agreement. Mm-hmm. That's doable as long as the donor is willing to give you this cell line. But internationally, it's much more challenging, and then especially with the more barriers developed in the recent years, it's becoming more and more difficult. And then for iPSC per se, like the induced pluripotent stem cells, and Notre Dame actually we have a lot of restrictions. We can't use much of the if it's like strictly iPSC, I think it's probably doable. I don't use them, but we do have a researcher here who started this iPSCs, and then for embryonic developed, there's a high barrier. It's just not possible. But if it's an adult patient tissue derived, there's a possibility, although I have not been involved. But those are, I agree with you, those are always challenging. And then you have to be considered this ahead of time, whether this is eventually become feasible or not. But remember, there's a lot of alternatives. Like for instance, if the cell line you try to create will not be able to, let's say, transfer, then what about having a more commonly distributable cell line, but use tools like a CRISPR or genetic engineering to engineer the mutation you're interested in into this common cell line? Then this cell line probably is much easier to share between investigators. So there are alternatives to create new lines. You modify the existing lines with the more powerful CRISPR-Cas9 approach instead of creating new lines. I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, I think asking it right now, you said you haven't had an issue with it.
We haven't got that far, but we could be there within 6 months or a year.
So that's great. I think that you're thinking about this at the perfect time. And I see Heidi mentioned it in the chat too, that it's a challenge, the international transfer of materials. And I guess this is the theme of the session, but starting early as possible is really key. Two places where the legality behind it is going to be not an issue, but potentially held up is understanding the agreement at a institutional level, so the two institutions that would be transferring the materials, and also from a funding mechanism specific level. So what are the specific mechanisms funding that lab, and what are the guidelines of that institution? If that work is already done, that's like so much time already established. It's going to be different depending on who's funding what and what is funding what, but starting there is a really good point to understand potential barriers that you may run into beyond that.
Okay.
Can you partner with someone like Coriell to help you navigate some of that? So if you're working, if you know you're going to have cells and somewhere internationally, can you partner with Coriell to say, all right, we want to collect these cells and house them, store them at Coriell? And then Coriell can probably, help you navigate like the legal issues and transfer agreements. So I imagine they probably have a lot more experience with that. I'm sure they've done this before, so you're not on your own trying to figure it out.
Yeah, that's a good point, Catherine. I should reach out. We haven't established a relationship yet with Coriell, but I guess I have talked to them in the past, so that way, and I know Rutgers is going to have some at some point. I don't know if have you worked with Rutgers?
We've worked with Coriell and Debbie, who is actually, she's speaking during another rare round right now, actually. From what I've seen just in our experience and talking to other rare groups, she's very helpful and available. So I would reach out to her.
Thank you. Thank you all for your advice and help.
And Haley, if you shoot me a note and I'll put my email in the chat, I can make an introduction to Deborah as well, because she's, to your point, just a wonderful person, and I think would be more than happy to at least have a conversation. And so with that, we are pretty close to the end of our time, and we do have some sessions coming up right after this. So I did just want to give us a couple of minutes to kind of move back, but wanted to ask if there were any final questions or last things that you wanted to raise. I know, or at least I don't want to totally speak for them, but I believe our panelists will both be happy to answer questions afterwards as well. And I'm happy to make an introduction. So I will drop my email, which is just annw@globalgenes.org. So hopefully pretty easy. But please feel free to email me. I'm happy to facilitate introductions, and just thank you everyone for being here, for asking great questions. Thank you to our roundtable leaders who did double duty on leading this conversation 2 days. It was a great conversation both days, and then interestingly, I think we definitely touched on some different things both days too. So just thank you to everyone. And if you are looking for the next session, there are 3 sessions, one on translational research, one on academic industry partnerships, and one on AI and machine learning for rare diseases. You access those just by returning back to the auditorium and clicking into the next session via the join button. And we'll be admitting everyone for the live broadcast in about 4 minutes. So we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again to everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.